Hello, I am your host, Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for another episode of ADHD for Smartass Women. You know that my purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. In the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, I've never met a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something. Not one. And so, of course, I am just delighted to introduce you to Katy Weber. Katy Weber is an ADHD advocate and certified health coach, founder of Women ADHD, and author of the book, Worth It, A Journey to Food and Body Freedom. Diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 45, she's made it her mission to help neurodivergent women learn to love their brains and live a more fulfilling, gratifying life. As host and producer of the Women in ADHD podcast, Katy draws from her decades of experience as a journalist, having worked for publications like the Wall Street Journal, the Daily News, the New York Sun, Metro International, and Hudson Valley Parent Magazine. Katy has appeared as an expert guest on numerous podcasts and has been featured in publications such as National Geographic, the New York Post, PsychCentral, and Health Central. Katy lives in the Hudson Valley, New York with her husband. There are two ADHD teenagers, two cats, and a dog. She loves hiking, yoga, and listening to audiobooks at 1.5 speed. Welcome, Katy. Did I get all
Thank
of
you.
that right?
It sounds lovely to hear back. Yes, thank you so much.
So before we start, you know, where we always go is your ADHD diagnosis. So I would love to know what that looked like. What's your story?
I was like you said in the introduction, I was 45, and it was the beginning of the lockdown, and I had been talking to my therapist, who I had at that point for probably 6 or 7 years, about really struggling with lockdown, as many of us did, because I felt like, suddenly both of my kids were on Zoom and they would come running out of their rooms. I can't connect, or, the internet's out, and I'm hungry. And I'm like, I just fed you, you know? And it just suddenly felt like during lockdown, as many of us were, I was the mom, I was the cook, I was the teacher, I was the housekeeper. That was a big one too. We lost our housekeeper. And so, it was, I kept talking to her about how difficult it was for me to start this new business, which now looking back, I think is hilarious, right? Because of course, that's what I would have been doing at the beginning of lockdown. I've got all this time, I'm going to start a new business. But we saw people online who were redoing their, decks, and, I had that project energy, but I also was interrupted all the time and felt like I couldn't concentrate and I couldn't get started. And now my therapist at this point had her middle schooler son had been diagnosed with ADHD a few years past. Then she was diagnosed with ADHD. And so she had, even before lockdown, been gently suggesting to me that I might want to look into it because, as we know, once you're diagnosed, you start looking around at all the people saying, oh yeah, you definitely have it. You definitely have it. So she would suggest it to me, but I just, I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a thing for little boys. I was vaguely insulted that she would think that I had it, because I was like, well, what do you think I am? Like, I'm an upstanding citizen. And so, but it was during that conversation that she said, like, dude, like, really look into ADHD.
Did you say, dude?
She probably did. And so I looked into ADHD. I took the self-test for adults from attitudemagazine.com and scored okay. I think I probably got like a 75 or something. So I was like, I found it's all the DSM questions. So I just was like, I don't really relate to this. I don't know what that means to be run by a motor. Like, aren't we all? Like, so many of those were about the physical hyperactivity, which, yes, I have it, but I didn't kind of recognize it in myself at the time. And so I decided to then I was, talking to her about how I was like, maybe I have it. Maybe I don't. What's the big deal? Like, it didn't really land with me. And then I took Sari Solden's test for women. And that's when it hit me like a ton of bricks, because her test for women, specifically for women, really delves into not only some of the sensory issues that that we don't talk about in the DSM, the emotional stuff that's never mentioned in the DSM, and a lot of the guilt and shame that comes with that. And that was when I was like, oh, wow, it's all connected. You know, it was like my whole life flashed before my eyes. And so that was, yeah, that was October of, well, I was officially diagnosed October of 2020. So this would have been, you know, the summer of 2020.
So were you diagnosed combined type then?
Yes, I was diagnosed combined type. And, you know, it was one of those situations where I had all the paperwork and all the self-assessments and everything printed out. And I went to my GP with all of the paperwork, you know, fumbling around, trying to explain the inside of my brain. And so worried, as many of us are, like so worried that she was going to say, no, it's not ADHD. And, you know, at this point, there had been so many months of me feeling like this answered everything. And I was so terrified that she was going to say, like, no, you know, like, you're just depressed, or no, you just need a good night's sleep, or all the things that as women we're so often told by our medical providers. And so, you know, I laugh now because she was like, yeah, you have me at, you know, you had me at hello. But still, like, looking back, I've often wished that I had a card or something, because I remember saying to her, I said, you have to tell me out loud that you are diagnosing me with combined type, because we were sort of talking around it. And I knew if I left that day and she hadn't specifically, like, explicitly told me, I would have doubted it, right? I would have gone home and been like, did I misunderstand this conversation? Did I get this wrong? And so I still kind of wish they would give us like a AAA card or something that we can keep in our wallets.
A membership card,
A membership.
like Mensa,
Right?
but better.
Exactly.
So, what were you like as a child?
Yeah, you know, luckily my mother held on to my report cards, because I couldn't tell you where my kids' report cards are. And I was really grateful that I had them, because that was one of the first things I did, was to look over my report card, because I remember often throughout, you know, I really struggled in university in Canada. Like, I really felt like I had some kind of learning disorder that I couldn't put my finger on. And, you know, and I was in the gifted program from the third grade all through elementary school and high school. And, you know, I was in this group of friends. We called ourselves the gifted underachievers because we, you know, always thought we were going to get kicked out of the gifted program and couldn't figure out why we were still there. And so I was looking back at my report cards, and it was really so emotional, because I saw this little girl in the, you know, before the gifted program. So I went into the gifted program in the third grade. My report cards before the third grade were, Katy's a born leader, Katy's enthusiastic, she speaks up, she's great reading, you know, she has all this confidence, you know, her handwriting is kind of messy, and she could probably, like, be a little more organized in her cubby. But for the most part, it was really, really overwhelmingly positive. And then I entered the gifted program, and so I don't know if it was just like expectations in the third grade when they start to really expect more from kids in terms of structure, but it was during that, and I went to a new school, so it was during that transition that my report cards suddenly started talking about my potential, how I wasn't meeting it, how I was talking too much. I was always, like, taken from the group pods with my desk, and my desk would get moved next to my teacher's desk. It was just this feeling of like, yeah, she's great, but there was always this focus on the things I wasn't doing in a way that I saw this poor girl over the years throughout my report cards, just like losing hope, right? Like losing faith in herself. And then by high school, I had a real truancy problem, because there were some classes I did really well in, and there were some that I just was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to go to this class. I'm going to skip it. And usually I probably should have failed, but, you know, a lot of the gifted program teachers would give me like a pity D. And so that was my report card. But like, I would never go to class. I was off in the park with my friends doing what I don't even want to say what we were doing. But, you know, it became like I just gave up on myself in a lot of ways during that time. And it was so emotional to look back at that confused girl who so desperately, you know, needed help. And it just wasn't there.
So you got yourself into college, though.
I know, right? Well, that's the funny thing.
That, like, what happened?
So I barely graduated, and at the time, this is dating me because anybody from Ontario will know that we used to have a grade 13. And so all the other provinces went to grade 12, except Ontario, we went to grade 13. So in grade 13, I graduated, but I didn't get into universities. All my friends went to university, and I didn't get in anywhere because my grades were so terrible. And I had that moment of like, okay, now what? Like, what am I going to do with my life, right? If I don't go to university. You know, I have two older brothers. They both went to very prestigious Ivy League schools with scholarships, and I was this black sheep. And and so I had this moment of like, well, what do I do if I don't go to university? And so I went back and redid my senior year, and so I like joked it was grade 14. I redid a lot of my classes. And because I had that determination, because I was like, I have to go to university because this is what is, I can't not, I got straight A's. I got all 90s that whole year. Isn't that funny? Like looking back when you say the signs were there all along, like that always, I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And I did, I didn't socialize because all of my friends were gone. I just really, really like put my head in the books and was able to produce that level for a year. It exhausted me, but that got me into university. So
Then you said when you got to university, that was really a struggle.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I flunked out of my first year because I, wasn't prepared. I didn't have any structure. I had so much freedom. I was, going out with my friends and partying all the time, but everybody else was partying all the time. And I couldn't figure out how they were able to like go to class and do their readings. And everybody else seemed to be able to do it and to do it all. And I could not. And so I felt really guilty. I was wasting my parents' money. And so I ended up dropping out after first year and taking a gap year and then going back. And again, once I knew that I had to do this and I really, really was motivated to succeed, I was on the dean's list then for the rest of those 3 years.
Can I ask you though, Katy, were you studying the same thing that first year versus the subsequent years, or did you find something you were more interested in?
That's a great question. I switched. I initially went into school for English and comparative literature, and I found it really boring. Plus, they were expecting us to read, enormous books every week, and I just couldn't keep up and couldn't, reading was so difficult already at that time for me. And so that was the class I failed, was the class that was supposed to be my major. But I really, really liked political science. And so when I went back, I switched and majored in political science.
It's funny to me though that you ended up becoming a journalist. So clearly the writing was not the problem. It was reading all these boring books, and if you're like me, I'm not interested in history. I'm interested in moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
So I can force myself if I have to, but it's not real time here now, which political science typically, there's a lot more of that. So you graduated from college, and then what?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I worked for the school newspaper, and that's how I sort of discovered journalism. And it was the first thing I had ever really felt like I leapt out of bed in the morning to do, right? And it was very exciting for me. So I worked in newspaper journalism for a while, and left Toronto and moved to New York State and met my husband and worked in newspapers for a while. And it was, it was great. I loved everything about being in a newsroom. I loved the late night deadlines. My ideal working shift was like 4 p.m. to midnight. I loved that because I had a lot of daylight because I would get seasonal affective disorder, seasonal depression. And so I loved having like as much daylight as possible. I loved working in the newsroom and being like on just, being so focused. It was just hyper focused for 8 hours. And then you would go home and then you would start there was no long-term projects. It was really like, it was so ideal for the ADHD brain now looking back at it. But then we got married and we had our first baby. And that's where it all like fell apart. I was still working. Yeah, we were living in New York City, so I had to work, right? I mean, we both had to work full time in order to afford living in the city. And so Not only did I have my first child and I went back to work after 12 weeks, which is criminal in this country, and I'm from Canada, so all of my friends were getting a year, and then their partner was getting a year. And so I was comparing myself to this other life that I could have had and feeling really like angry and frustrated and embarrassed and all of those emotions, and was back in a newsroom, so there were no offices. It was all just a big cubicles and desks. I couldn't concentrate, so I was terrible at my job that I used to love, and I also felt like a bad mom because I was working full time and had left my child at such a young age. And so I was like, that's where it I really struggled. And we eventually decided we were going to leave the city. I stopped working full time. It was just this sort of series of events after that that often happens to women when they become parents, which is like we're sold this idea that we can do it all, and if you can't do it all, then it felt like I had failed as in all of these places that I used to love. Oftentimes after my diagnosis, I wanted to go back and just like hug that version of me, the new mom version of me, because it was so difficult. Yeah, but I was a journalist for many years, and then became a stay-at-home mom, which I thought would be easier, but it was worse and miserable, and in like all the other reasons why it was miserable. It was boring, so boring.
So for how long did you do that before you said, I can't do it anymore?
Well, I mean, so I became a stay-at-home mom when we had my second child. So we left the city and moved up to the Hudson Valley so that we could live on my husband's salary, and so I could be a stay-at-home mom. And so when my son was born, very quickly I was like, this is not the life for me. So then I became a chronic volunteer person, right? I became the volunteer mom. I became super involved in my community. I was dragging my kids everywhere with me. That was how I dealt with the boredom of young children. And I joined the PTA, so I was in the PTA and eventually became the PTA president. And so, and I also at the same time had all these certifications. I got my yoga teacher certification because I was like, maybe I'll become a yoga teacher. And I got my health coaching certification because maybe I'll do that. It was just like this long list of constantly learning and trying to think of what I was going to do and be and entertain, just that feeling of like, I need to learn stuff, but also trying to find out who I was a lot of that time. And so I was doing that up until lockdown. The night that they shut down our elementary school, we were just about to put on this huge musical at my son's elementary school that I had produced. And it was like everything was going a million miles a minute, and it just all got shut down that night. And it was devastating. But I look back at that time and I really liked lockdown because all of that, it was like an elimination diet, right? It was like everything got taken away. And then we had this opportunity to bring things back one at a time. And I was like, oh, this is what it feels to be regulated for the first time in my life. And, I learned a lot about myself in terms of introversion and really liking being alone and then, the diagnosis and everything else happened from there.
I've heard that from a lot of ADHD women. Those of us who were privileged to be able to stay at home during the lockdown, and we weren't, having to go out and, do all the services that were required. That lockdown was actually really peaceful because all the stuff that you thought you had to be at and go to, it was all gone, right? And it just became about like your core family and maybe a friend or two, that was a really, really good friend. And so I experienced the same thing. And then both my kids came home. Like, it was so fun. But I realized that, we could afford to do that. Mm-hmm. And, at the same time, I felt so terrible for the families who didn't. All I could think of were the single moms, right? Who had these kids at home that were doing that, in the house learning. And then they had to do it was terrible for them, I'm certain. So right after that, you got diagnosed. So you are one of the unusual women did you get diagnosed before your kids?
I did. I got diagnosed before either of my two kids. And immediately after I was diagnosed, I was like, well, if I have this, my son has this, because he and I are cut from the same cloth. Never in a million years did I think my daughter had it, because she did really well in school and she's self-motivated and she's, was so together. And I always felt like I was so frazzled and such a mess.
Is your daughter, I mean, this sounds like my daughter, actually, I mean, it wasn't until she went to law school, literally this year, that she was finally diagnosed because of all the reading. She could not get through the reading.
Yeah.
But it sounds like our daughters were similar in that, like, she was always top of the class. She had this perfectionist kind of, everything had to be perfect. She studied all the time, probably too much in hindsight. Was that the same experience that your daughter had?
Absolutely. And, I remember her calling me from school when she got a 70. She found out from her French teacher that she was going to get a 75. It wasn't even on her report card. It was like a quarterly report. And she had missed an assignment, and so she was going to get a 75. And she called me. She had a complete panic attack meltdown, and I had to pick her up from school because she couldn't stop crying. And I was like, well, this is not okay. Because I was like, 75, that's great. But But it wasn't until I started talking to other women who were diagnosed in adulthood that I saw that profile over and over and over again of the really, really, did really well in school, but then compensated with anxiety and then ended up with depression and anxiety diagnoses in adulthood, that I was like, oh, that's my daughter. Okay, so that's also what ADHD looks like.
Yeah. Overachievers.
Yeah, exactly.
So how old was your daughter when she was diagnosed?
So that was in 2022. So she would have been, it was just before she was going into high school, because we wanted to get her diagnosed so that we could get her accommodations in high school. Yes. And so both of my kids went through, and I just had a conversation with my GP. Both my kids went through the whole battery of testing because I thought there might be maybe some dyspraxia and dyslexia in there with my son. And so we did the whole battery of psychological testing with them, and they both ended up with ADHD memberships.
Was there any other learning challenge?
My daughter had one of the lowest scores I've ever seen in auditory processing, which I thought was really interesting. But no, they both ended up with generalized anxiety as well. That disorder was thrown in there. That diagnosis was thrown in there too.
Katy, have you ever met someone with ADHD who doesn't have at least a little bit of anxiety?
I know.
Right?
Well, especially after COVID. I mean, I feel like we are still really trying to parse that, how deeply affected we were by the lockdown. And both of my kids really, really struggled with returning to school and a lot of that anxiety. And so, I'm not surprised that they both ended up with that diagnosis.
And that's another area where I feel so lucky. Like, I look at parents like you, parents with younger kids, which I think would probably be even worse, but I'm not sure, because I think the high school years are really important, the junior high school years. My kids, where my son was a senior in high school, and so he was graduating and already knew he was going to go to NYU. So he had a lot to look forward to, right? It wasn't like his whole high school years were decimated, or junior high school. And my daughter was graduating from college. So they came home. They were kind of wrapping up the end of their school, in up until May, graduated, and then, everything, like, we didn't have to deal with so much of what you all had to deal with in terms of Zoom. And, when kids are younger too, it's like, help me. Versus if Zoom went down with my son, he'd know, oh, I could help myself better than mom's ever going to help me, right?
Right.
So I didn't have to deal with any of that. So, yeah, it's all kind of, I didn't realize how impactful in a negative way often COVID was to children in general, just, across the board. And frankly, their parents, because I didn't experience that. And it always comes down to, we can see it, but until we're in it, right? We just don't, it's like, we know what ADHD is because we're in it. Versus someone who, they're just diagnosing people with ADHD. They're never going to get it as much as someone who's in it.
Right.
Between the time you got diagnosed and then did you right away jump into, I'm going to start a podcast?
Pretty much. I've now in hindsight, years later, I've started admitting that I actually started the podcast before I was officially diagnosed, in that I knew I was going to do it and I was reaching out to people and I was recording the interviews. I hadn't launched it yet, but I had already, the train was on the tracks before I got diagnosed, because I remember thinking, like, if I don't get diagnosed, this is really going to be awkward. And, of course, but it really, what it was this was so profound, this realization, and it was lockdown. So I was really just wanting to have conversations with people, other, especially other women who were diagnosed in adulthood, because I was like, I can't be the only person who went through this, profound shift in my self-concept. And so I thought, well, nobody's going to want to have a conversation with me unless I create this platform and an excuse to reach out to people. And so that's how it all started. And then it kind of kept going.
So the reason I started it is I wanted to learn more. And I felt like, we know now, okay, if you want to get something done, make it fun, make it challenging, and or make it social, right? And so I see now what was going on, but I started the podcast because I wanted to meet other women that also had ADHD, because I discovered that I really liked them. And I wanted to meet them from everywhere in the world. And so I'm curious if part of that for you was also the social component, wanting to learn as much as you possibly could. And of course, when we have a podcast, we can get people on that know more than we do pretty easily once the podcast becomes popular. And then we can learn from them instead of just learning from a bunch of books.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I didn't realize it at the time. It's usually kind of looking back, realizing, oh, this is absolutely how I learn, through conversation. And, and then I thought, well, that makes sense, because I used to interview people for a living as a journalist. And so, I'm like, oh, yeah, that all makes sense that we're doing that. But a lot of it was just feeling lonely, and also, really loving and feeling so nourished by these conversations, and feeling like I was connecting with strangers. It was like we were crashing into each other for an hour, having the most intense conversations, and then maybe we'll see each other again, maybe we won't, maybe we'll talk, maybe we won't. But it was like there was no pressure to then, remember their birthday or some of those other things that we often feel inadequate about when it comes to friendships. And it was like, oh, this is like a really wonderful way to feel less lonely, and also learn more about our brains and what's happening here. And it was, I remember, like, when I would first start the podcast, it still happens, but like I would burst out of my office and just be like, I have to go run around or something. Like I would be so stimulated by these conversations. And my husband was always like, oh, great. He was just laughing at me running outside. It was so great. And it, answered a lot of those questions for me about, why I always liked waitressing. Because I think it was I think I always liked waitressing because it was like you had these non-committal relationships where you could just sort of talk and be genuine, but also, and then they'd be gone. You'd be like ships passing.
What I've noticed, though, and I'm curious if you have the same experience, for the most part, I would say 90% of the people that I've spoken to on the podcast, maybe even 95%, I feel like even though we may have only had a 1-hour conversation, if I ever needed anything, I could call them and they would be good for it. Like there's just this instant connection, usually with other ADHD women.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I remember the first time I went to the ADHD conference and ran into some of my guests in person for the first time. And, 2 years had passed and we still embraced each other like we were besties. And that is, I think, unique to that relationship. You just feel so warmly towards each other, and that doesn't go away.
Yeah. So, okay. Other than me, because I've been on your podcast, who has been your most fascinating guest? And if you asked me that, I don't know that I could answer.
Don't make me choose. There was one summer when I was first going back to graduate school, I decided to do like not a best of, because I felt like there's no way I could possibly come up with a best of, but I reran 10 episodes that I felt like deserved another listen because they might have been older or, and I felt really bad because I was like, this isn't my top 10. I don't have favorites. I love all of you so much. Oh gosh, how am I supposed to answer that, Tracy?
I don't know.
I mean, interviewing Sari Solden was such a big deal for me because of my connection to her. Her book was the first one I read after my diagnosed, and so getting the chance to interview her was so wonderful for me. So I would probably say her or Casey Davis was another one I interviewed. I don't know if you've spoken to her or met her. She's such a force, and I think it was one of those, conversations that I got so much feedback on in terms of, we talked a lot about being a stay-at-home mom and some of that shame that comes with how much of your self-worth is wrapped up in your job and working. And yeah, I felt like it was like she's a counselor, so I thought it was like a therapy session talking to her. And yeah, so off the top of my head, those are probably the two that I think of. But I mean, I love all my children.
I know. I always say that hosting and creating a podcast is the best self-development you can do. I'm constantly encouraging other women to start podcasts, right? Because if it's something you're interested in, it will lead to something. You will meet people that you just never expect to meet. And I'm curious, do you agree with that statement? And if so, what has podcasting taught you that writing a book and or being a journalist has not?
I totally agree. I think it is, I think one-on-one conversation is how we heal when we are diagnosed. And I didn't realize it. I've always felt kind of weird when I started, when my podcast got enough listens that people started writing reviews. They would always thank me for this podcast. And I felt very awkward about being thanked for this podcast because I was getting so much out of it. And it was so selfish. It was such a selfish endeavor in the beginning. I just wanted to learn more. I just wanted to, I never thought about putting it out there and and how it would be received. And so it was very fascinating and it felt great, but it was also a little bit like, you're welcome. Like realizing how wonderfully symbiotic this relationship was for this triad of the interviewer, the interviewee, who was benefiting so much from that 1 hour of sharing their story or just, talking out loud about neurodivergence and ADHD. And then also the listener was getting stuff out of it. And I just thought that was so wonderful because I never really thought about the listener benefiting, in that way, because I never really set out for one of those podcasts that would give tips and tricks. It was really just this long form, who on earth is going to listen to this, two of us ramble for an hour? And, but it turns out, that's what we like. Because I knew that's what I liked. And that was really when I started the podcast. I really just wanted it to be like, what would I listen to? What are the questions I would ask? And that's where I feel like being a journalist really helped me because I really could tap into, what's interesting to me is likely interesting to other people. And that's what in journalism, you kind of have to go by that instinct all the time in terms of the questions you ask and in terms of the stories you tell.
I mean, they're all kind of similar, right? It's really about finding things, researching, and then sharing it.
And telling our stories and hearing other people's stories and the validation that comes from knowing you're not alone and all of that, I think is so central to, especially an adult diagnosis. But I think, anyone with ADHD really, we're constantly trying to remind ourselves that we are wonderful human beings and that we have a lot to offer.
I think people come to the podcast often not knowing that about themselves, right? So it's not even that they need to confirm it constantly. No, it's that they don't even know it at times. And I think those are probably the ones that you get, the reviews that, oh my God, you completely changed my life.
Yeah, definitely. It's the conversation, it's the one-on-one storytelling, and it's the sharing of our lives that is really, the number one way to treat quote unquote ADHD.
Okay, so that's what it taught you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, I think one to one is really great, but there's something about a group, right? That you start seeing your brilliance in that person and that person and this person and like you look around and everybody's brilliant and suddenly you realize that, oh, well, I'm part of this. That must mean I'm brilliant too, right? There's a part of it's just about finding where is that brilliance. It's not am I smart? It's how am I smart?
Yeah, well said.
So you wrote a book, which I didn't know. I didn't know this about you, Katy. And wait a minute, did you write this book 2021?
No, I wrote it in 2017. So it was
Before
before
the
my
diagnosis.
diagnosis. Yes. I was working as a health coach. And so basically, after my son was born, I joined Weight Watchers to lose weight, and I loved it. It was wonderful. I lost a ton of weight. I became a Weight Watchers leader because, of course, I was like, you want me to, lose 1 pound a week? I'm going to lose three, because that's how our brains work. And so I loved it, and I was a Weight Watchers leader. But then I ended up developing a binge eating really, really severe binge eating from being a Weight Watchers leader and the extreme dieting that I was doing. I ended up, really delving into some of the anti-diet work and diet culture and health at every size. And so I was working primarily as a health coach with binge eaters and kind of binge eating recovery. And I had, at this point I had left Weight Watchers because I was noticing, people were coming back to Weight Watchers over and over and over again saying, this is the only thing that works for me. And I'm like, well, if you're here for the sixth time, it's not working for you. And so my book was, as I was working as a health coach and working with women who struggled with binge eating, I wrote my book about kind of my journey of leaving Weight Watchers and embracing my body, quitting yo-yo dieting and eventually quitting binge eating. And so after my ADHD diagnosis, I was like, I have to call all my clients and tell them we all have ADHD because I had no idea how common binge eating was with ADHD and just sort of how ADHD plays into extreme dieting, yo-yo dieting, that perfectionism, and all of it.
Working out all the time.
Right? Yeah. And kind of like trying to develop balance in our life is a full-time job. And so that was really interesting to me. So the book it really doesn't say or have anything to do with ADHD, but, it's clearly written by an ADHD person.
I'm curious, the clients that you worked with. So I'm assuming you got to know them fairly well. And now, knowing what you know, when you look back, are you pretty confident that they all had ADHD?
I would say most of them, definitely. Even the conversations we would have in Weight Watchers meetings, it feels like that kind of environment, that kind of place is just, we're like moths to a flame with those sorts of places. So I'm pretty sure most of the people that I worked with in Weight Watchers had ADHD because of that struggle that we have with being in touch with our hunger cues, right? A lot of the stuff that intuitive eating is also just as hard, right? And so that was the other thing, was that I really, really struggled when I left dieting and tried to embrace intuitive eating. I really struggled then with intuitive eating for a host of other reasons. And so I felt really adrift in terms of like, what does healthy mean to me? There was a lot of that deep work around like, I can't just like eat because I'll eat until I'm stuffed all the time. I don't pay attention. I'm from the Clean Your Plate Club generation. So, intuitive eating didn't really feel like the right path either. And, so that feels like many year journey.
So what advice do you have for women with ADHD who struggle with food, binge eating, body image, all of it?
Yeah.
And I know that's
Right? It's a big one. I think not tying health to weight is the biggest thing, in terms of like dismantling a lot of diet culture and kind of what our motivation is, right? So that's a big one, like we were talking in school, like when you are motivated, you're going to go after something. And so when we are motivated to hit a number on the scale, we're going to do whatever we can to get there as fast as possible. And so that's where I feel like, if we can understand that that's what's happening in our brains, then we can start to dismantle that a little bit and really start to look at like, okay, why do I want this? So we talked a lot about like, what am I trying, who will I be when I reach this number, and we talk a lot about what we're seeking by trying to lose weight, but then also knowing that with ADHD, we need structure. We really like being told what to eat. And I don't think we have to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to the things that really appeal to us with programs like Weight Watchers, like tell me exactly how many points to eat every day, right? And so it's like getting to the bottom of like, what is it that appeals to me about diets? What, I like being told what to do. So how can I bring that structure into my life in a way that isn't going to be constantly depriving me so that I then start to binge eat? And so where I start with my clients is always talking about, if you're desperate to stop binge eating, the first thing you have to do is recognize that binge eating is a symptom of something else. Binge eating isn't the problem. Binge eating is you and your body reacting to that deprivation. And so where is that deprivation in your life? Is it a calorie deprivation, or is it an emotional deprivation, right? Is it something that you're reacting to in yourself, in terms of expectations of yourself or depression or all the ways in which we will then want to soothe with food.
Do you still do that kind of work, but specifically for ADHD women?
Yeah, basically not all of my clients, it's not all we talk about, but I think it's one of those things where a lot of my clients in the beginning were coming to me, I didn't feel comfortable calling myself an ADHD coach because I didn't have the training. I just was trained as a health coach. And so I was sort of like, we'd have these conversations like, I am a health coach, so we're going to talk about food, but we have ADHD. So our conversations would very quickly move into relationships and parenting and all of the other things. And that's where I was sort of like, I'm in way over my head. But I also knew I was helping. And so it was, I got to that fork in the road where I said, okay, either I need to go back and become an official ADHD coach. But what I really want to do is go back to school to become a therapist, because I felt like I was diving into a lot of therapy talk and it felt unethical and I wasn't trained. And I feel like with coaching and therapy, there's so much intermingling going on with ADHD that I felt like I would probably be better off going that route first and then becoming an ADHD trained therapist. That was my thinking. But also, realizing that a lot of women were asking me, like, can you recommend a therapist who understands ADHD in adult women and understands an adult diagnosis? And there's not that many out there. So of course I was like, okay, well, give me 3 years and, I'll be back.
And so are you in the middle of that right now?
I'm in the middle of that now. I'm in my second of 3 years to become a therapist, a mental health counselor.
And how is that?
It's amazing because I did so poorly in school, I credit my ADHD diagnosis with me even going to grad school in the first place. So that's something that has been life-changing since asking what has changed since you were diagnosed. The belief that I am smart has, really the biggest change. And I really thought I was just dumb. And because of my relationship with school and always being so confused about why I couldn't read or why I couldn't do this or why I had such difficult or why I could read, but then I couldn't turn around and write an essay about it, right? Like all of those ways in which the processing was really difficult. And so now that I've gone back to grad school, which is wonderful. They also stopped requiring the GRE for this program, which I was really appreciative of, because I don't imagine I would have done very well. But I still knew I was smart, right? And so that has been amazing. And I really feel like I'm in the right place, talking about like all of that stuff, the journalism background, the podcasting background, all of my interest in ADHD it makes sense that I love counseling. Like I definitely feel like I'm in the right place, having these conversations with people, helping people. Like it all makes sense, but it's frustrating because ADHD, autism, neurodivergence is just not talked about in the curriculum still. And I feel like I am the person in the class with my hand always raised, being like, we talk every case study we talk about. I'm like, have they been screened for ADHD? Have they been screened for autism? Because I'm seeing it everywhere. Yeah, it's, I sort of oscillate back and forth between like, it's everywhere. And then also being like, well, if it's everywhere, am I the one who's confused? And so I'm constantly asking other ADHD psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists. And I'm like, it's everywhere, right? And they're like, yeah, it's everywhere.
Everywhere in that world.
Right, exactly. Right. Those
right?
spheres.
These are the people that are struggling. Mm-hmm. And I've thought about that, but I'm just so worried about, the focus on what's broken. I don't know if I'd be very good at that. I'm afraid it would make me sad all the time.
Well, and I think that's where you kind of forge your path, right? Like, I'm not going to be that therapist. And I'm grateful for my coaching background because I do feel, and I'll only be licensed in New York. So if I want to work with people outside of New York, I'll still be using that coach hat. But I feel like the combination of coaching and forward thinking and that now what question that we always have, it's like, I don't think any of my clients are interested in talking about their past traumas. I think therapy does use a lot of coaching more so than I think we give it credit for when we are trying to distinguish between coaching and therapy. I think there is so much more overlap, but it's muddled, right? It's confusing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I'm impressed that one more thing you can add to your hat. So, what are the ADHD traits that you have that you feel are responsible for your success?
Oh, I think curiosity is probably the biggest one. When I talk about, that like we've talked about that desire to learn, right? Like for somebody who was convinced for 45 years that she was dumb, I always was listening to, podcasts and books and new certifications and like the evidence in my life, writing a book, like, the evidence throughout my life of that lifelong learning. It makes me laugh now to think that I still was doing all of that and convinced that I was lazy and stupid and all of those things when, why wasn't I curious about that? Because I feel like, we're problem solvers, right? And the biggest problem in our life is ourselves, and that's the biggest puzzle. And I felt like I was constantly trying to solve the puzzle that was me. And but I think that drive, that curiosity, that insatiable desire for learning is something I really appreciate. And I think it's helped me to be where I am and to then really lean into working with other women and helping them become curious and come from that place of like, no, the evidence is there. I'm actually quite a smart person and we can figure this out. I got this, right?
Well, and especially because you said both your brothers were Ivy League educated. Were you just thinking, oh, someone just shook the dumbstick at you?
Yeah, basically.
Did you feel like they were any smarter?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I thought, it's funny because my mother, we would joke about how like they got all the good genes and I got the leftovers because I was the third child. And my mother would always say things like, you're not book smart, you're street smart. And it's okay. Like, I think she was trying to be nice and she was saying like, it's okay. Not everybody has to go to college. Not everybody has to be all of these things. Like you have your strengths. But all I heard was you're dumb. And so it's interesting because now as a parent, I'm like, well, what do you do in that situation? Because I want to encourage my children to do all the things, but I also want to push them to succeed in a way that is meaningful to them, right? And that's where I felt like I was kind of adrift a lot as a kid because I wasn't it was like, it's okay that you're not good at things, as opposed to, well, let's find what you're good at and really,
Yeah.
lean into that. And so that's really been eye-opening for me. And just as a parent, it's very, the wording is very complicated.
Yeah. So I'm curious what your what your kids think about all this, especially since they both have ADHD.
I think it depends on the day. I think they are very, very proud of me. And I think that they love their ADHD. I think they wear it like a badge of honor. I think they've been, their generation really has no problem with mental health issues, or talking openly about it. They don't think of it as any kind of deficit, but they also know that, they need structure and they need help, right? And that's where I think I have been able to really, my parenting has changed tremendously since my diagnosis, because we talk about, that idea of like, well, what do you need? If you are not succeeding, what do you need to get there? As opposed to, it's okay. You don't have to succeed, because I understand how important it is to succeed. And so they know, and my daughter has accommodations, and one of the things with the getting her, we had to really fight for them because she did so well in school.
Yeah.
And and I'm really grateful that I did my homework and knew my stuff when I was sitting in those 504 meetings, because her teachers were like, I don't get it, like, she's got 90s, why does she need accommodations? And I remember saying to the school psychologist, even, I said, my children are coming home and bursting through the door either in tears or just falling apart the moment they get home to a safe place, because they are holding it together all day. And the school psychologist said, well, that sounds like a home problem, not a school problem.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
So they just didn't see, right? Exactly. Oh my goodness. It was so,
Psychologist said that, not a teacher.
no,
The
the school
psychologist.
psychologist said, well, you should get them in therapy because it sounds like a home problem. So not only was it insulting and patronizing, but, they just didn't see the at what cost, and that, yes, my children do really well in school. Yes, my children are holding it together all day. But what's the cost? And I've seen the cost now from interviewing all of these women. I know that cost is depression, anxiety, perfectionism, people pleasing, all of those things that lead to burnout. And yeah,
Yeah. And worse.
yeah.
And worse, certainly for women. So, okay, before I let you go, do you have a number one ADHD workaround?
Okay, well, first of all, I credit you for giving me an Apple Watch, because, years ago you had your, like, my top 10 things I love about ADHD. And when I was diagnosed and I was listening to your podcast religiously, the first thing I did was, I have to get an Apple Watch. And it really has been life changing. I mean, if there's one thing I can think of that has made the hugest difference, it's being able at any time during my walking my dog, being out there, anytime driving, I can say, remind me to blah blah blah, right? Add avocados to the grocery list, right? Like, just being able to talk to my watch has been really life changing. But then I realized, like, what that's doing is what I call with my coaching clients parking something, right? Which
Yeah.
is, I don't have to deal with this right now because I've thought of it, but I do have to give it a parking spot. I do have to give it a day and a time that I will then deal with it. And, one of the things I laugh about is, like, over the weekend, I do that where I'm like, remind me to call this person, remind me to email this person. And everything is Monday at 9 a.m. Because in my ADHD brain, everything is urgent, right? Everything is, I have to, as soon as I get back to work on Monday, I have to do this. And I laugh because Monday at 9 a.m., it's like bing, 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 all of those notifications. And then I park them somewhere, and then at Monday at 9 a.m., I know that's when I can deal with it. And I say, okay, I'm not doing this now, but maybe I'll do this Wednesday, or maybe I'll do this Thursday. But I always make sure it's attached to a day and time, because, ADHD is so different in women, and so, we're all so different in terms of the things we struggle with the most. I am not a messy person. I'm actually quite an organized person. Yeah. So for me, it's working memory, it's memory. And, and so for me, that this knowledge that I have to have it attached to something. I can't just trust myself to maybe remember it is kind of, that's my number one workaround. Always park it
Okay,
and
park
use
it.
your watch.
And the watch. I mean, I think with the watch, the minute I got it and I started using it, it just completely reduced my anxiety because it means I could offload my working memory like this.
Exactly, exactly. You don't have to think about it until that time and day. And yeah, it frees up so much bandwidth too. Yeah.
Totally. Okay, Katy, are you working on something that you want to tell us about?
In addition to being in school, I am in talks to write a book. So it was one of those things that I was like waiting. I was like, just finish school, just graduate, and then you can think about the next thing. But, I got approached by a publishing company, and of course, I was so excited that I was like, yes, of course I could do that. So I'm not sure what the timeline's going to be because I really do want to focus on getting my certification and finishing grad school. I don't know what the timeline will be, but that's sort of the next thing, and is working on that and coming up with like kind of what's the book as I'm sure you did, what's the book I wish I had had when I was diagnosed. And I think a lot of it will be, I don't ever think of myself as an expert. I think of myself as a seeker, an interviewer. And so this idea of like, I'm not an expert, I don't know how I would ever tell anybody what to do, is throwing me for a loop. So I think it'll probably be an extension of, the podcast, in that I will be interviewing and telling other people's stories. I think that's where the power is, and I think that's where my interest is. So that's what I'm working on right now, and yeah, and hopefully by 2026 I will be a working therapist.
Oh my gosh. And that's a lot. Plus, you have two kids still at home.
I have to put my kids through college. Yeah, there's that too.
Yeah, yeah. That's why we do it as well. So, Katy, where can people find you?
Yeah, well, womenandadhd.com was the URL I snatched up when I got my podcast. So it's sort of morphed into an LLC where it's really just some, resources, the podcast, but also, that's where I also will book coaching, and I do still work one-on-one with clients. So womenandadhd.com.
Perfect. Everything's there.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Katy, thank you so much for spending time with us here this week. And for me personally, I just loved getting to know you better.
Well, thank you. I mean, I know when I interviewed you, I'm unabashed about my love for your podcast and how, I'm so grateful for how you were my ADHD midwife and ushered me through my diagnosis and taught me so much. So it's been I'm so grateful. It's been such an honor to be now on your show. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Because you know what it's like, right? We love hearing that our work is making a difference. It's really,
Absolutely,
really
yeah.
important. And I think it's part of the ADHD brain, right? Gold stars. So that's what I have for you for this week. If you like this episode with Katy, please let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brains work so that they too may discover their strengths. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week.